All right. Well, welcome everybody to the City of Santa Barbara Fire and Police Commission meeting for September 23rd, 2021. We missed you all last month. We will get right into the agenda. Item number 1 is call to order. So Carol, can you please do that?
Sure, Chair Stedman. Chair Stedman.
Here.
Vice Chair Rodriguez.
Here.
Commissioner Allman.
Here.
And Commissioner Travis Teague.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, item number 3, are there any changes to the agenda, Carol, or either of the chiefs?
No
Okay.
changes on my side.
Okay. Commissioners, any changes?
None here.
All right.
Changes from me, thanks.
Okay, excellent. Let's move on to item number 4 then. Approval of the meeting minutes of July 22nd, 2021. That seems like such a long time ago. Is there any discussion, or will there be a motion to approve those minutes? Anyone?
That's good. I'll move to approve those minutes.
All right, a second? Do we have a second?
I second.
Okay. We'll have to do another roll call vote. It was pointed out to me the other day that for online meetings, the city likes to do roll call votes for every item. Did you hear that too, John?
Did I hear that?
I'm sorry, Commissioner Allman. I meant Attorney Doimus.
Okay.
Oh, sure. Hello, Chair Stedman. We have 5 commissioners, so we can do it by voice recording the 5-0 or roll call. Either way you want to organize it. So I'll leave it to your deference.
Okay, perfect. All right. So there is a motion and a second for the approval of the meeting minutes of July 22nd, 2021. All those in favor say aye.
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 All right, that's unanimous. That motion carried. That item carries. All right. Do we have any hands raised for public comment, Carol?
It looks like we do, Chair Stedman. Mr. Howard Green, I will unmute you and you can speak.
When's her birthday?
Hey, thank you very much. I would like to make a suggestion for a current and future agenda, and that is particularly since you have a member of your commission who is also on the Formation Commission, to have just a little bit of a catch up. Those meetings are kind of long, and I didn't get to attend yesterday, so that's a modest suggestion. Thank you.
All right. Noted. Thank you, Mr. Green. Any other hands, Carol?
I'd just like to note for the general public that there will be an update on the Fire and Police Commission in the I think it's later on in the agenda. We usually do an update. So thank you, Mr. Green, for your interest.
Yeah. And can everybody make sure their lines are or their microphones are muted? I hear a little bit of background noise, just a little bit. Okay. Fantastic. So there are, go ahead.
Correct. No other hands raised, Chair Stedman.
All right. Thank you, Carol. Moving on to item number 6, old business. Are there any items for old business? I guess the IT department is not here, right? Because I'd like to hear from them on old business, but we'll let them speak at another meeting. Okay, so let's move on to item number 7, dance permit approval for Music Alley at 4 423 State Street.
Thank you, Chair Stedman. I'm joined tonight by Lori Peterson, the Department Business Manager, who will give you an update on this permit.
Excellent.
Lori, are you there?
Hello, sorry, my volume was muted again. Took me a second to get there. So I'm before you again this month with a new dance permit. This one is for Music Alley, which is located in the 400 block of State Street. They've gone through and received all the necessary approvals from the various departments and have moved forward. They've completed their live scan as required. They've submitted their application with the information regarding the periods in which dance would be conducted. The earliest time would be 2 p.m., with the latest being 1:30. They've got 6 security guards to be on staff at times when that is happening. And those staff would have clearly identifying T-shirts that they were there for that purpose and communicate via radios and verbally. They have some interior speakers and some exterior speakers, but the exterior speakers would not be permitted during the dancing hours in order to contain the sound within the interior of the building. In the report, as you can see, that they did have some noise complaints earlier in the year, but once that issue was addressed, they've had no additional complaints. And so staff is satisfied with them meeting the requirements of the code and recommend that they be allowed to have a dance permit. Are there any questions?
Oh, one question. So their licensing fees, their permit fees are all up to date, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Okay. That is all I have for you, and request your permission to move forward.
Yeah. Carol, could you read the recommendation, please?
Recommendation, the Santa Barbara Police Department recommends that a nightclub dance permit be issued to John Iho, owner of Music Alley at 423 State Street, with the following conditions. 1, music and/or entertainment should not be audible beyond 50 feet from the premise in any direction. 2, windows must remain closed during hours of dancing. 3, rear doors must be kept closed but unlocked at all times during the operation of the premises and may not be used for public entry or exit except in the case of emergency and to permit deliveries. 4, except in the case of an emergency, no patrons shall enter or exit the premise through the rear doors. 5, no patrons may loiter in the parking lot to the rear of the business. 6, a minimum of 6 security guards must be on duty from the start of dancing until the close of business nightly when dancing is occurring. 7, no live entertainment, dancing, or amplifying system or device shall be permitted on any patio or outdoor area. Televisions are permitted on patios and outdoor areas. 8, licensees shall police the area under their control once an hour to prevent the loitering of persons about the premises. 9, licensee is responsible for maintaining an orderly line of patrons awaiting entry into the premises. The queue of prospective patrons must not block passage of pedestrians on the public walkway, nor may it extend into any nearby street.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't realize that was so long, Carol. It's quite a recommendation. Is there any discussion or questions from the commission regarding the recommendation?
Question, I did read through the whole thing, and I think the fire department, of course, is involved. Do they, and have they posted occupancy load signs? I didn't see that anywhere, but probably they have. Anybody know?
Yes, I believe they met all the requirements when Sergeant Brown met with them and did the tour of the facility with Dan Green.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the commission? All right, any public comment, Carol?
No public comment.
All right. If there are no further questions, public comment, or discussion, we can entertain a motion to vote on this recommendation. I would like to motion to vote for approval on this recommendation. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Okay. Carol, can you please do a roll call vote?
Chair Stedman,
Yay.
Vice Chair Rodriguez,
Yes.
Commissioner Allman,
Yes.
Commissioner Travis Teague.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. The permit has been approved. Motion carries. Thank you. Now we move on to item number 8, police and fire liaison reports. John, Commissioner Allman, do you want to say anything or update us?
I had a brief conversation with Chief Nails yesterday, and he is very, very busy, but we did talk about some highlights of what's going on in the department. I think he'll cover that nicely when he talks. But there's some changes and good changes and all positive things.
Did I read recently that we promoted someone to chief? Or am I stealing the thunder for Chief Nails?
Well, you might be. They have now have a deputy chief that they've hired, but he can introduce us. I'm quite sure he'll be on today. So, deputy or administrative chief. I'm not sure how they call him at the moment, but he'll be introduced, I think, today for sure.
Great. Looking forward to that. As far as the police liaison, Chief Malecki and I, and under instruction, Commissioner Diane Travis Teague we haven't met really. We had a delay last month and we had the same short agenda. So we haven't met. But I did want to commend the chief for one thing I'm noticing a lot on social media are these videos that have been appearing in my Instagram feed. So that all looks pretty positive. And I know hopefully for our next meeting, the chief will provide us an IT update on projects that are in flight. So that's really just a pickup from the last time that Commissioner Travis Teague and I and the chief all met, and there are no further updates. Now, I think that's a good segue. We can go right into item number 9, which is for you, Chief, the police department update.
Thank you, Sheriff Stedman and Commissioners. Pleasure to provide you a brief update today. You are correct. It's our plan to give you an IT update at the October meeting. Dennis Diaz, our IT director, will be there to review a lot of the projects. And I'm optimistic that by that time we'll be able to give you a little bit more detailed report on the status of the body-worn camera rollout, which is actually underway in a very phased manner. So we'll get back to you with that one. A couple of changes within the department effective on Saturday. The captain rank will be replaced by the title of commander, and the captain insignia will be replaced by 2 stars. This is to serve two purposes. One is to create parity with the Sheriff's Department personnel who occupy the same sort of the same span of control as well as other local agencies. And secondly, to reflect the fact that 3 or more years ago, the deputy chief position was eliminated and the captain's position became direct reports to the chief of police. And so there was a restructuring of the job description to reflect those additional duties that they've taken on. And in addition, as I've talked about at previous meetings, there were 3 captains and a deputy chief, and there are now 2 captains and no deputy chiefs. So that span of their span of control and their amount of workload is improved or has increased, and the commander job description will reflect that. That title change will formally go to council on October 4th, but the working title change will occur this Saturday.
Wow.
Chief, where in the, I guess, direct reports does the commander lie? Is it chief, commander, captains?
The captain position will now be replaced. It's the same people, but they have a different title. So Commander Arroyo, Marilinda Arroyo, and Commander Todd Stoney will continue to report directly to the chief. In keeping with this title does reflect their workload, but in keeping with everything that we try to do, there is no pay increase associated with this at this time. Secondarily, and I'm hopeful that by I don't know if we have a meeting in November or not, but it may be at the October meeting, depending on where we are. Our staffing levels continue to be a challenge. We're functionally down close to 30%. And in keeping with that and maintaining the focus on neighborhood problem solving and emergency response, we are restructuring and reprioritizing calls for service. So there's going to be a greater emphasis on online reporting and on scheduled appointments for non-emergency responses. So for example, if somebody were to call in at 9 o'clock at night with a found property report, normally the way we've historically done this is we would send officers to their house to pick the property up. We will try to encourage them to bring that property to the station and book it in. We'll book it in at the front desk. And if that's not practical for folks, we will schedule an appointment during the day when we have more people on duty for somebody to come out. That's just one example of a number of changes. Those changes are actually, they've been sort of been being phased in for the last couple of weeks. They officially start in terms of restructuring our CAD system. They'll kick in on October 1st, so that's a week from tomorrow. And I hope that by the October meeting, I can give you a greater update on how that's working out and exactly what that looks like. Crime stats very quickly for the month compared to last year. Violent crime is down 5%. Functionally, it's no real significant change. Property crime continues to be our concern. It's up 13% in the aggregate, with a real increase in commercial burglaries, which are up 40%. We have we're working with LAPD. We've made a couple of arrests in the last month on they're called South American burglary gangs. They're a group that come up from Los Angeles into Ventura and Santa Barbara County. And so we've been working on that. Interestingly, arsons are up 79% from the year before, from 14 year to date last year to 25 this year. But interestingly, half of those have been in the last 30 days, June, July, and August. And a lot of that was that rash of fires that preceded the Loma fire in June. Our use of force is about the same as where it was last year. And the number of arrests for resisting or interfering, which is usually an indicator of how officers are interacting with people, is down 15% from year to date last year. I don't know whether there's any questions on crime statistics.
I have just maybe a couple of questions, maybe a comment on the online reporting. Is there an uptick on that, or?
Yeah, the department actually has had an online reporting system for several years. And nearly 20% of our non-emergency reports last year during COVID, the height of COVID, were filed online. And we're trying to encourage that. Those reports that are filed are then reviewed by detectives to determine which ones have follow-up and which ones don't. And we try to acknowledge all of them. And I can tell you that before I started with the department, I did have a prowler at my house at about 4 o'clock in the morning. It was captured on Ring video. And I used the online reporting system. I found it to be very efficient. But what I was most impressed with is that within 3 hours of sending that report in, and at that time, I was not the chief, and I don't think anybody had any reason to know that I was going to be the interim chief. I still got a response within 3 hours, looking into it and asking for the video. So it's a very efficient system.
That's great. And one comment I was going to make, there was a really good stop down on Milpas at a jewelry store a couple of weeks ago. It was really, really a good operation. I heard it, and they got the person, and it was very nice, very good.
Yeah, that individual had done a number of rooftop burglaries along Milpas and along parts of State Street, and patrol really did. There was a great communication between detectives gathering information from the reports and feeding it to the patrol officers, and it worked very well.
Thank you to the troops. They did a great job on that one for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. The last thing I have to report is I've talked before about my employment status with the department. I think I advised you the last time that because of the 960-hour cap for PERS retirees, that I was probably would be with the department only until the end of the year, possibly right afterwards. However, this last Monday, the governor announced that the 960-hour cap is suspended for the foreseeable future in response to COVID. And the city asked me if I would stay longer. They need to apply for a waiver, which they're going to do. If we're going to commend anybody, I really want to thank Mrs. Mlockian, who said it would be okay for me to keep doing this for a while. And so I plan to be here at least through the middle of next year, or until we get a permanent police chief. And I'm really hoping that occurs sooner rather than later, but that's going to be dependent on the selection process for the new city manager.
I think that's good news.
I think
Yeah,
that's very good news.
I'm glad you addressed that.
Well, that's the end of my report. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any questions from commission?
But yeah, I think that's wonderful news. There's so much transition happening in our city leadership, so it's great to know that we, have consistency and somebody with such great experience and well-known good work in our police leadership and through March. So wonderful news. I do have a question. I'm curious about the bridge housing taking place on the Rose Garden Inn. Has that impacted calls for service for the police? Increased, decreased, or changed?
Thank you, Commissioner Rodriguez. That's a good question, and I should have jumped on that. I reported on that as part of the housing department's report to council. I was asked a question about that. The calls for service at the Rose Garden in itself have gone up, but that's not surprising given that they have 2 security guards on duty and as well as CityNet staff. And so there are people in a position to call us. Most of the calls have really been around disturbances, often from people who sort of want to get into the property and camp. However, we also did an analysis of criminal activity on a half-mile radius around the Rose Garden, and comparing it to the same block of time last year, July and August, which is the months that we had. And as you recall, the Rose Garden opened up the early part of July, and really there's been no significant change. There are a couple of problem locations behind the Auto Club building and the Bank of America where people are congregating, but the reported crime has not changed very much.
And are you just curious if you're able to differentiate other calls for service related to homelessness? So I know that in the past year, there's been a heavy amount of expense on fire and police call for service for homeless related calls. And I'm curious if because these usually service resistant folks are now placed in bridge housing, has that reduced calls for police?
I don't want to speak out of turn. And so the most direct answer is I don't have any reporting that those numbers have changed significantly in one direction or another. But let me review that in some more detail and make sure I'm answering accurately.
And then my last question is, I'm curious about the CommStats that you just reported. Is it possible to have quarterly CommStats posted on the city police website so that it's available to the general public?
It is, and I actually thought we were doing that. Those reports come out monthly. So we are in the process of changing over our website, both within the department and within the city. But I was under the impression that we were doing that. So let me look into that.
Thank you.
That's all I have.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments from the commission? Thank you for your questions, by the way, Vice Chair. Highlighting a lot of important points. Carol, do we have any public hands raised?
No hands raised, Chair Stedman.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chief. And we'll move right on into Chief Males and his report.
Good afternoon, Chair Stedman, Commissioners Allman, Rodriguez, and Travis Teague. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Hi. Thanks for having me back again. It's good to see all of you, albeit still on the Zoom or go to webinar mode, but one day we'll get there. Thanks. I know you're really busy today. I know you've got some training, and so I don't want to take too much time. So I'm going to forego a couple of normal reports that I give, and what I'll do is I'll give a little longer report next month, excuse me. But I wanted to share a few things with the fire department. I talked with Commissioner Allman yesterday and gave him a brief update, and so I'll elaborate a little bit more and let you all know what's going on with the department right now. I will share my new division chief. That's the current term is Fire Operations Division Chief. He is on. I'll have him on in just a few minutes. But I wanted to share a little bit about what's going on with the fire department. We have had a very, very busy summer, as you may have heard or seen in all the news. We have deployed a number of resources all over the state of California, and I thought I'd give you just a little report on where your Santa Barbara City firefighters have been over the last few months. So as you know, the state is experiencing a multi-year drought. You know that we had very little rainfall over the last few years, and unfortunately the intel that I'm getting is that we will likely have possibly another dry year There's about an 80% chance of a La Nina still forecasted for this next year. So that, of course, is on our radar. But right now, we are in the midst of a significant fire season. The fires in the state of California typically travel from north to south. So we start to see fires up in the northern region of California. And then as the season progresses, we start to see fires developing in Southern California. Now, that's just a general rule. That's not, you know, I can't set my watch to that. But it is proceeding exactly as we expected. We've had a number of fires in Northern California, and they've taxed a lot of resources, or they've called in a bunch of resources because they've been such long and sustained efforts. Most of us are old enough to remember that, boy, a 20,000 acre fire was big, and then a 50,000 acre fire was big. And then the next thing you know, wow, we hit 200,000. How do we hit that? Well, we're hitting near 1 million acres on our fires. The Dixie Fire has continued to burn, and they're making some great progress on it, but we've had a number of our firefighters on the fires. So I'll just share a little bit about where we've been. Beginning in June, we had firefighters assigned to the Crane Fire and the Tennant Fire. July was the Tumbleweed, the Beckworth, Granite Pass, and the Dixie Fire. August continued with the Dixie Fire, the Caldor Fire, and the River Complex. And as we get into September, we still have resources, or over the last couple of weeks, resources at the Dixie Fire and the River Complex. So a total of 9 incidents that we've responded to outside of our jurisdiction. We sent 10 different strike teams, and those 10 strike teams worked a total of 96 operational periods. Now, an operational period is either 12 hours or 24 hours, depending how the incident is set up. But that's a lot of operational periods. We also, over this last couple of months, have had 19 personnel out on what are called overhead assignments. And really what that means is single resource. The incident requests one person. That could be a division group supervisor. That could be a radio operator. That could be a line EMT. Any number of positions where they need one person. We have fulfilled 19 requests, and actually we're higher than that because we just sent out a couple of resources yesterday, but they haven't returned, so I'm giving you kind of completed numbers. So we've been really busy. We're kind of in a lull. We kind of, you know, fall is in the air. People are kind of seeing some cooler temperatures, but with fall comes the Santa Ana winds, and they are expecting the normal Santa Ana winds to hit the fall. As you know, September through December often has been when we've had our major Southern California fires. If you recall, the Thomas Fire started on December 4th and finally burned into the city on December 16th. So not until we get several inches of rain on the ground and stop seeing the Santa Ana winds will we let our guard down a little bit. But as has been publicized, our wildland season really has turned into year-round, especially with this drought. So that's just a quick report on incidents. I mentioned earlier that I will provide a couple of reports in October. I'll provide some monthly fire department reports and some quarterly fire department reports, since we'll be finishing the 3rd quarter of the year. And I'll let you know some of the trends that are happening with the fire department. I can tell you that our calls for service are back up, and they're about where they typically are. As I mentioned in an earlier presentation, our calls for service went way down during COVID for a couple of months, but we are back up and trending at about approximately 4% a year is kind of about what our calls tick up. So we're seeing the normal call volume return. So I mentioned earlier that I've been able to make some changes. When I came in as the acting fire chief, if you recall, the fire chief and operations division chief retired. I immediately had the position that I was in, plus an operations division chief. Also had a fire marshal retire. And in the last couple of months, or last couple of weeks, I should say, also had our acting fire marshal, or captain investigator, leave our department and became the fire marshal of the city of Santa Maria. He actually lives up in Santa Maria, and he actually came from Santa Maria, so he returned to Santa Maria. So the first announcement I want to give you is that our investigator 2, Ryan DiGiulio, is bumped up right now to acting fire marshal. We are running a deficit staff over there due to the budget cuts, but we anticipate to return to full staffing in July. If you recall, during the council budget hearings, council did allocate $100,000 for wildland fuels mitigation, and they allowed me to hire an additional person as a defensible space inspector. That inspector starts in the end of October, and we're looking forward to him joining our team, and he'll provide a very valued service of going out and inspecting residences to ensure defensible space. Those inspections have gone way up. There are new state requirements in high fire hazard areas that actually, before you sell your house, you have to have had a defensible space inspection within a year. So we expect, and really insurance companies like you to have them once a year. So we expect that service to increase. So we have a new person doing that, which will be great. I also was able to promote a battalion chief. Battalion Chief Michael Hoos has joined our team. He came from, he was a lead captain for a while at Station 1. And then his latest assignment, he had worked up on the Mesa at Station 6. So he is now our training battalion chief. And Brian, if you want to come on the line, I wanted to take a minute to introduce our new division chief, Brian Fetterman. Brian has been with the department for a whopping month. This is his 4th week. And Brian came to us from the Lompoc Fire Department. I held outside, or what we call an open recruitment. Brian applied for the position and excelled in the test. Did really, really well. He did especially well because of, for several reasons. Number one, his work ethic is amazing. He's extremely intelligent, extremely collaborative, engaging, outgoing, friendly, all the things that I find in just a great person and manager. But most importantly, he had experience in our county. His most recent assignment, he actually had been the acting fire chief of Lompoc for almost a year. Before that, he had been a battalion chief. So Brian joins the team. He has hit the ground running. I'll share just kind of a funny story. When I went back to the interview board, one of the when Brian was being interviewed, one of the questions I jokingly asked was, which one of these candidates can run circles around me? And they all said Fetterman. And so, you know, as I've said before, my dad always told me, you don't have to know everything. You just have to know people that know everything. And then the other thing he always told me was hire the best possible team you can, inspire them, lead them. But when it comes time, get out of their way and let them do their job, and they'll do a great job. So Brian joins us. I will double check here. Brian is on the line. So Brian, if you just want to take a few minutes, introduce yourself to the Fire Commission.
Thank you, Chairman Stedman and fellow commissioners and Chief Mills for the warm welcome. As Chief mentioned, this is my 4th week with the department, but I really feel honored and privileged to be a part of this great organization, the public safety team in the city of Santa Barbara, and just hoping to serve all the residents and guests. I've been privileged to work in this operational area as a firefighter for over 20 years. So getting to come into a great organization and continuing just to build on the relationships and the networking throughout all the departments within the county is really a key to our success. So got lots to still learn and lots of great people to be introduced to and meet. But thank you for your dedication as a commission and helping convey our needs as well as the community's needs back to us. So thank you for the warm welcome.
Thanks, Chief Fetterman.
Congratulations, Chief.
So in the interest of brevity, because I know you have a long agenda today, I'll conclude my presentation, but it looks like Chief Malekian has something that he wanted to say. And but actually, maybe first, do you have any questions for me before I turn it over to Chief Malekian? Okay.
Looks like you did a thorough job.
I do.
Okay.
Just kind of curious, the same question that I asked Chief Malekian, if with housing, homeless and bridge housing, has that reduced calls for service for fire? I know that a lot of the medical emergency calls were for homeless individuals. So I'm just curious if that is having any impact on our public services.
Chair Stedman, Commissioner Rodriguez, Commissioners Allman and Travis Teague. Last week, council gave a very, a briefing about the bridge housing and did discuss a bit about the calls for service in the 6 targeted high fire hazard area homeless camps have indeed gone down. We have seen a marked decrease in the amount of fires. However, we still do see an occasional fire, and we have seen fires in other homeless camps that have popped up throughout the city. I'm not aware of any particular increase in call volume at the Rose Garden Inn. I know we typically do have a call or so a week there. I would have to pull the stat. I haven't drilled down so far as into the stats, but I will say this, not to dodge the question, but I'm going to answer it a little bit more generally. Across the nation, and our city included, we are seeing very sick people in our community. Often due to COVID, often due to a fear of going to the emergency department or the hospital. We are seeing an increased amount of medical calls across our city, and we are seeing sicker people. In speaking with my medical director for our department, Dr. Jason Przdowski, he is seeing very high acuity in the emergency department also. So, you know, obviously we respond to 911 calls for service, but you know, I can just say that we do appear to be seeing an increased call volume. So again, not necessarily related to bridge housing, but so it's gone down in some areas, but medical calls in general have gone up.
Okay, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So commissioners, real quickly, and I know that he doesn't want me to do this, I'm hoping that Deputy Chief Fetterman is still around. But earlier this week, Chief Males and Chief Fetterman observed a mentally ill woman who appeared to be suicidal sitting on the ledge of a building. And they took pretty prompt and immediate action and got her off that ledge and got her into some appropriate level of care. And I thought you should both be aware of that. Sorry,
Excellent.
Chris.
Thank you. I'll interject for just a second. I can't take much credit other than I answered the phone and made a phone call. So just a little bit more information on it. Chief Fetterman was driving, returning to the station and witnessed this incident, took really quick action, called me on the phone, said, here's what's going on, I need some help. And he did an absolutely outstanding job of mitigating what was sure to be a significant medical event as a result of this individual. So I think it was truly a case of being in the right place at the right time. And I think anybody on the fire department would have done the same thing, but that's our job. We spring into action at any time. But you know, he was simply driving up the street in his vehicle and witnessed it and jumped out, called me, and then I called dispatch. And I have to also share my deep appreciation for the police department. The 3 officers that arrived, I've known them for 20 plus years. Their expertise, compassion, care, empathy that they brought to the situation, I was immediately impressed. The care, it was just, it gives me goosebumps because it's just, you know, I'm a dad and I look at, you know, a child who's despondent and I just think, wow, I mean, you know, we see a lot of really horrible things in our job, and to be able to make such a acute and positive change to a critical event like that, and then have the support staff show up with the police department was very humbling to see. So, but I give all the credit to Chief Fetterman. I just took a phone call and made a phone call. He did all the work. But thank you, Chief Malekian, for that acknowledgement.
Thank you.
Applause to both fire and police for managing that situation so well, for saving a life.
Yay.
And what a way to welcome Mr. Fetterman. Thank you so much.
Yeah, boy, just hop right in there and start with the crisis. We'll move on to item number 11, new business. Are there any items for new business from anyone?
I do. I'm wondering, so normally in August, we vote for our chair, vice chair, and liaison positions. We skipped that this time around, but I think it's good though, because it always ends up being like right before new appointments, and it last time around it caused a bit of tension. So I'm wondering if we can schedule that or agendize that for the January meeting when we have our new commission.
Yeah, I mean, I'm perfectly fine with that. We are experiencing and managing, through very difficult times, right? We've had a lot of change. And I think that's a stable recommendation.
Great.
Is there any other discussion on that? I know, I don't know if Commissioner Allman was around then, right? And certainly Commissioner Travis was. But you're right, it was a little disruptive last time, but we managed. We have made it through, so I think that's a good recommendation.
And just for commissioners' awareness, the application for appointments open, I believe, late October. So if you know folks who you think might be a great addition to the commission, please encourage them to look at the city website for appointment information.
I agree, and I will add, based on my own experience, that we want commissioners in the pipeline who understand it's a 4-year commitment. Right. So it's not, a couple of months or a year, it's 4 years. So, and unfortunately it goes by pretty fast. So, all right. Are there any other items for new business? Okay, we'll move. I guess you have that noted, right, Carol? Of course she does. So,
I'm sorry, the addition of moving chair and vice chair to January? Yes,
right.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Let's move right into item number 12, staff communications. Vice Chair, do you want to make some comments?
Sure. So the Community Formation Commission met last night. Thankfully, it was just a 3-hour meeting, I think. It's been going pretty long. And this is a 14-person commission, 13 voting members, 1 alternate. It's a diverse group in age, gender, profession, life experience, and other diverse qualifiers. The Santa Barbara City Council formed this commission after summer protests following the killing of George Floyd. And so far we've, I don't know how many times we've met, but we were meeting once a month. Now we've moved to twice a month meetings with work group meetings in between. So it's a very active group, and we are putting a lot of time and consideration into our recommendations. So far, we're still in the early part of the development of the proposal. We've decided that we would like to recommend an auditor-monitor model with an investigation component when needed. So that basically means looking at policy, looking at trends, looking at impact of policing on community, as well as should a complaint come to the commission, having the authority to investigate that complaint. We're in the process right now of getting into the details of what that would look like. We're in the brainstorming phase. We've brainstormed the purpose, the composition, the selection or the appointment, and last night we brainstormed the training. So this is just kind of a brain dump, 15 people coming together and throwing out our ideas. And then probably in the next month or so, we'll start to fine tune those ideas. October 20th is our next meeting, and we'll be brainstorming the authority and duties portion. That will be the conceptual recommendations that we will then bring to the community through community education and outreach with a feedback component. So we're presenting this to the community. We're asking for their thoughts and ideas and recommendations. And then we're going to consider those recommendations before presenting an official recommendation to the city council. So there's lots of steps. We're still in the very early part. I imagine, next month it will be a very dynamic conversation when it comes to looking at authority and qualifiers. The city council has approved a consultant from NACOL, the National Association for Community Oversight of Law Enforcement. And so Cami has been facilitating the meetings, and which has been extremely helpful. And they've also approved or pre-approved funding for the survey, and that will be a researcher who will help design and implement and analyze the survey.
So I
Any
have a couple-
questions on that?
Yeah. What can you say the name of the model that you think is going to be adopted again?
Sure, I call it the all of the above model. It's the auditor monitor model. So there's an auditor model, a monitor model, and then an investigative model. And so we're choosing all three. We are many cities, when they start to implement a oversight body, they do that in response to a major event that occurred in that city. So the main focus tends to be on the investigative portion of it, because ours is more a development of the social political landscape of our nation, and not a very specific incident in our community. The commission thought that it would be useful for that oversight body to also look at data trends and how law enforcement might be impacting, how is it impacting our community?
And when you talk about a survey, because I've been involved in another survey in another department, that sounds that if there's funding approval for it, that it's going to be a pretty extensive survey. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Sure, we've had a couple conversations with researchers about what a survey would look like, and I think a survey sounds like a much bigger, questionnaire, but this is really a request for feedback. And we've heard from a researcher saying that 5 questions tops would be appropriate. Did you understand the material? Was it well presented? Do you agree with it? But then it's also important to get demographic information. So we want to make sure that we're reaching a diverse group of community members, so that we're not solely focusing on one particular group. So we do want to collect demographic information just for the data, not to get the details. And then because we want to reach a diverse group who may or may not feel comfortable using electronic form or written form, we're also looking at or exploring the idea of what's called a community cafe, so a focus group type data collection.
That's pretty sophisticated, at least compared to my experience with other departmental surveys that certainly were trying to elicit critical information. But it's good to know that you guys are carefully organized.
Mm-hmm. And just for to be more specific, it's a hybrid model, review board, auditor, monitor, that has an investigative component when needed. And if Mr. Green or anyone else in the community or public is interested in learning more, we are publishing as much of this information on the city website as possible, so folks have all the information. And there have been a couple of people who have come and attended the meetings and spoke during public comment. So We're getting some community participation right now. We're encouraging more.
I'm confident that at some point you'll get plenty of it.
Yeah.
You'll get plenty of it.
Thanks
Great.
for all your hard work, Commissioner Rodriguez. I know it's very, very time consuming, but thank you so much.
It's an honor to be part of this important project. And I said it before, but I have to say, I think the City Council did a wonderful job selecting the individuals who are participating. It's diverse, it's dynamic, and we just many different perspectives and feelings about all this. So I think they did a great job.
Great. Well, that's good feedback. Commissioner Trousty, did you want to say something? I saw you lean in. Maybe not.
I was just going to say thank you to Commissioner Rodriguez for her input and for her insight, because I know that she also brings a lot to that committee. So thank you very much.
Right. A person of action. So, all right. Are there any other staff communications anybody wants to offer at this time? Okay. All right. Let's move into item number 13, which is the training item, race and policing. So do we have someone from the city, Vice Chair, who will take over at this point?
Yes, I believe that Graciela, Chief Malekian, and Lieutenant Hill will be leading this part. And I am so looking forward to this. So thank you for being here.
Chief, were you going to present prior to me, or should I go ahead and start? I believe the PowerPoint is up with the diversity items.
I'm happy to start. I didn't know if you wanted to make an introductory remark or not.
Please go ahead.
Next slide, please. I think this is yours, actually.
Okay.
Carol is.
I'm sorry, Chief. Who would like to present? I can go back to your PowerPoint.
I'll go ahead. I can put it up if you want to share a screen, but it'd be easier if you did.
Okay.
Thank you. I think it flows better that way.
Hold on just a moment. Okay, Chief, I've made you presenter.
Okay, so it'll be.
I think.
So can the commissioner see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I titled this segment, "The Evolution of Policing," and how this is walked through. This is a very, this is normally about an 8-hour lecture that I do for Cal Chief, so I'm condensing it to about 15 minutes. I thought you didn't want to stay here till midnight, so we will go on. But policing in the United States, and I can't see what's up, so I just clicked Watchman model. Is that what's in front of you?
Yep.
Originally, in colonial America, there were no organized police forces. The first organized policing forces would not really come online until London in the early 19th century. But the Watchman model were in local communities were either handled by soldiers or not at all, and sometimes they were basically prisoners who had been arrested and sentenced for some local infraction, and their sentence was to walk around at night and essentially be the watchman and sort of sound the alarm. It was generally agreed that this was not a particularly effective way to do things, but it was what was done. Originally appeared in Boston around 1636, and in New Amsterdam around 1638, which, as you know, would later become New York. First modern police forces in London emerged in about 1829, formed by Sir Robert Peel, who is famous for his description that the public are the police and the police are the public. And this idea that the policing forces should be professional. Part of that professionalism, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when we get a couple of slides from now, but essentially that the police, it was interesting, while he used that phrase about the police or the community, or police or the public or the police, part of professionalism was this arm's length relationship from actually dealing with people. Your mission was simply to enforce the law. First organized police force in the United States was in Boston in 1838, followed very closely by other major cities. Policing was distinct from the military, but it was modeled after it. And if we had more time, I did my doctoral dissertation on police discipline systems. Part of it was the relationship, or what I recall as a kind of a weak imitation of the military model being applied to policing services. Originally, the first sort of era of policing that would last from 1838 till probably close to the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century was called the political era, or the political model. Legitimacy in terms of government was derived almost exclusively from the local political power structure. Biggest example of that is Tammany Hall in New York, where the political machine essentially controlled all of the aspects of local government. And part of policing, and part of how policing was utilized was by hiring people from the neighborhood, hiring very often from immigrant groups that the political group wanted to make sure voted a certain way. There was no civil service protection. If you ran afoul of the political machine in some fashion, you were very likely to lose your job. There were little or no training or hiring standards. In this case, it was simply you were given a job and sent out to enforce the law in some loosely defined fashion. I think one of the essences of the policing service, and we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about race and policing in more detail, was that the function of the police in almost every jurisdiction, and policing in America was and is local. It is very locally focused. We have over 18,000 police and sheriff's departments in this country. The largest is New York at around 35,000 officers. But in excess of 70% of the departments in this country have 50 or fewer officers, and a very large number have fewer than 25. So there are a number of very small forces. We'll talk a little bit about the problems that this creates. But their primary objective in almost all cases was to support and maintain the local status quo. So whoever it was that was empowered, whatever it was the social norms were present, that was their mission. I've used this example when I talk about race and policing issues in Pasadena. There are African Americans, and a lot of people don't realize that Pasadena was a minority city. It's home to the oldest Black community in Southern California. And at one time it was nearly 40% African American. Today it's about 12% and about 40% Hispanic. But there are people in Pasadena who remember when they could not swim in the municipal pool. And there are people in Pasadena who remember when they could not walk east of Fair Oaks Avenue after dark. And you won't find this in the city ordinance, but it was, if, for example, the example I always use is if an African-American person in the 1940s or 1950s, and by some accounts into the early 1960s, was to show up at the municipal pool and want to swim and were denied entry and created a disturbance, they very likely would result in a call to the police, and the police would threaten them with arrest. And so these narratives, and I'll talk a little bit more about my sort of theory of conflicting narratives in a few minutes. But it's important to hang on to one of the things that sort of stayed a residue from the political era is this notion that the purpose of the police force was to maintain the local political status quo. There's been publications, most recently the 1619 Project, which is attempted to sort of link the slave patrols of the South with the evolution of modern policing. That is not accurate in the true sense. The slave patrols were never formally part of government, but they were a formal part of the society, and that image that links those two continues to this day, and because of the other issues that I mentioned earlier, is a sort of a big part of how policing is perceived, particularly in communities that have been marginalized. As we moved into the one of the trademarks of the political era, well into the 1930s and 40s, was in effect rampant corruption, and police officers were not highly paid. Part of that maintaining the political status quo involved sort of low pay scales, really not a significant amount of training, and a dependence on interaction with local business. Beginning in the 1950s with the Los Angeles Police Department and Bill Parker, who is credited with creating what came to be called the professional model of policing. And the professional model did substantially increase training. There was a much heavier emphasis on military protocols, rank structures, saluting, uniform appearance. The training was improved dramatically. LAPD is probably rightly credited with beginning the first really serious police academies that trained the entire department. But part of the primary goal of the professional model was to eliminate corruption. And there's you can have some interesting debates if we were inclined, because for example, the excessive use of force was not necessarily seen as corruption per se, but stealing a newspaper off of someone's driveway for the officer to read was a firing offense. And so you had this kind of weird definition of what constituted corruption, but essentially this idea that you would take anything that wasn't yours, that you would take kickbacks or bribes or goods and services from businesses. The goal was to really drive that out. Part of that, though, was this sort of arm's length relationship with the community, and this idea that you could not rigidly enforce the law, you could not impartially enforce the law if you had relationships with people. And so the idea was that you kept people at arm's length. You did not have relationships with people, and your purpose, your job, was to rigidly enforce the law. Now that's, if I had a longer time, we could talk about the nuances of that, but that was the essence of the professional model. I will say that before completely leaving the professional model, that this issue of sort of the political status quo in the sense of maintaining Tammany Hall kind of moved on somewhat, but the issue of maintaining the social status quo was maintained. And so there is a widely held perception, accurate in my opinion, for example, in Los Angeles, that wealthier communities were policed differently than poor and minority communities were policed. I think one of the issues that we talk about as we talk about the Oversight Formation Commission and things like that, is to recognize that policing is local, but that narrative, that national narrative, is where this comes from. Beginning with, it really started with the Presidential Commission report, President Johnson's report on policing in 1968, which was in response to racially motivated riots across the United States in most of the major cities following the death of Martin Luther King, following the murder of Martin Luther King, and really pointing out the disparity of policing in America, particularly the differences in how Black communities were policed versus white, wealthier communities were policed. George Wilson Wilson and George Kelling wrote a piece in the Atlantic magazine in 1984 called Broken Windows, and began the process of what was known as community policing. But the idea was just kind of the opposite of the professional model, with the idea that you should build relationships with the community. The idea was threefold, although two of the aspects were spoken loudly and one was spoken softly. One, that you should build relationships between the police and community. Second, that the focus should be on solving neighborhood problems, solving community problems together. And thirdly, the part that was whispered a little bit more quietly was that it would transform the culture of policing. Unfortunately, and this is, and as some of you know, the COPS office was created under President Clinton in 1992. And its focus was to make grants, hiring grants to really drive home the principle and spirit of community policing across the United States. I had the privilege of being the COPS office director from 2010 until 2013. I will say that it's my opinion that community policing philosophy is absolutely correct, but that in most police departments, what you had was bifurcated policing. You had traditional 911 response-driven, complaint-driven calls for service, followed by, but underneath that was this community policing, which was almost seen as a separate operation. Community policing too often was a program rather than an operating philosophy. There were other variants of this problem-oriented, Herman Goldstein's problem-oriented policing, which tend to focus on specific neighborhood issues. David Weisberg's work, which won him the Stockholm Prize in Hotspots Policing in the early 2000s, which indicates that even there's a tendency, if you look at maps of cities, to say, well, crime is concentrated here in this particular place. In Pasadena, it was Northwest Pasadena, where a large measure of the violent crime was committed. But David Weisberg pointed out that if you drilled into that more deeply, you would find that even in the so-called most violent neighborhoods, that the violence actually only occurred in a fraction of spaces. And he actually did his hotspots refers to block by block assessment of crime activities in particular neighborhoods. And when we talk about what we're trying to evolve to here in Santa Barbara, it's a version of that, to recognize that we put scarce resources where there are actual problems. And again, one of the issues with community policing is to ensure that it is in fact a philosophy, an operating philosophy of the department, and not simply a specific program like a bike patrol or a storefront operation or something like that. One of the realities of American policing is that, as I mentioned earlier, is that it is very local. There are 18,000 agencies in the country. As you can see there, they are very small. I'm not going to spend a lot of time unless any of the commissioners have questions, want to come back to it. But there is a difference between sheriffs and policing in terms of how service is delivered. But many cities now in the country, particularly in the Western United States, as newly incorporated cities form, they found that forming police departments was expensive. And it was less expensive to contract with the sheriff's office and define a specific delivery of service. So for example, in Los Angeles, there are 88, Los Angeles County, there are 88 incorporated cities, but only 44 of them have their own police department, and 44 of them contract with the sheriff's office. And similarly here in Santa Barbara County, we have 8 cities, and 4 of them contract with the sheriffs, and 4 of them have their own police departments. The strength of all this localized policing is that law enforcement can be responsive to local needs. There are strong community relationships if it's being done right. And for the longest time, one of the strengths was that the overwhelming majority of your officers came from the community that hired them, and they lived there. And so they were sort of part of that, the fabric of that society. And political control remains local. I don't think it's an accident when I talk about Los Angeles County and the fact that 44 of the cities contract with the sheriffs. However, 70, I think it's 70 or 71, John might know better than I do, 70 or 71 of the cities in Los Angeles County contract with LA County Fire to deliver their fire services. So there is a less of this sort of political sensitivity to the role of fire service than there is about police service. The challenge of localized policing and the way that it is that, again, the department is dependent on the local community, and the department can be reflective of very negative local values. And so probably one of the biggest examples of this, the unrest in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 was less about the death of Michael Brown and more about the historical usage of the police department to issue citations and to get warrants issued for people, which the Justice Department found they were using to help fund the city's general fund. And so you had a poor community that was being overburdened by this police activity. One of the other things that has changed over the last 20 years, partly because of housing prices and other social pressures, is that officers no longer live in the community. They are driving longer distances. They move away from here, and consequently, their connection with the day-to-day fabric outside of their enforcement role, which I think is an aspect of policing that gets forgotten sometimes. And I know from experience, having grown up in Santa Monica and lived there for a long time, and then I was on the police department. I lived in the city for the first 3 or 4 years until it was time for me to buy a house, and I couldn't buy a house there anymore. So I moved out to the valley, and I was commuting. When I took the job in Pasadena, I commuted for the first year, and then I moved into the city. And the difference in terms of my perspective and view of the community changed very dramatically, because just the simple act of going to the grocery store, going to a movie, or doing the things that you do as part of daily life, you get a very different view of a community than if your only interaction with it is when you're enforcing the law and in your role as a law enforcement officer. And again, I apologize. This is normally an 8-hour block of instruction, and I've tried to condense it. But I'm happy to answer any questions now or at the end of this presentation when Graciela and Lieutenant Hill are done.
Okay, if there are no questions for the chief, I can.
I do have a couple questions, but
Yeah,
I'll let
I have a
anybody
question.
else ask first. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question too. You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Chief, just quickly, what's a ballpark figure of how many of our officers live outside of the jurisdiction?
About 80%.
Thanks.
So,
Say outside of the jurisdiction, 20% of our officers live in the South County. So that's anywhere from Carpinteria to the western edge of Believe, so not just in the city.
Got it.
So I was attending virtually some of the NACOL oversight conference sessions, and in one of them, there was a discussion about community-oriented policing and just commentary that it ended up being a bit of a transactory sort of exchange. If you do this, we'll do this kind of exchange, and so departments were moving more towards what they call a relationship-based policing. And so I'm wondering if you could speak on that with our local department.
Yeah, and I think they were saying the same things I was saying about this bifurcation between programs and philosophy. I've heard it described in different ways. I actually think that that our Santa Barbara Police Department is pretty effective at relationship building and recognizing who people are. One of the things that I started in Pasadena and I thought it was cutting edge, and I found out we've been doing it here for a long time, is that when the officers come out of the academy, they spend 6 weeks in a locally based, locally focused sort of training program. Now I'm going to review the agenda of that and see if we need to make some adjustments. But I think this opportunity to introduce people to the community and convey this philosophy that the function of the police department is to help solve neighborhood problems. And whether we call it relationship building or a community policing philosophy, we can call it whatever we want. But it's basically that you don't lock yourself into this role playing, which goes on too often. And we're a small enough city and people know each other well enough that I think we can always do better, but I think we're in a pretty good place on that.
And then I'm curious if the training that you just provided us, is that given to our law enforcement officers either through the police academy or through that 6-week community orientation?
I know the police academy touches on the issues of race and policing and its historical aspects. I was involved in an advisory commission last year to the Los Angeles Police Department, and I know that they're actually doing some very cutting edge work in talking and teaching the history of the Los Angeles Police Department to their recruits, but specifically bringing in community members from South and East Los Angeles to talk about the historical negative interactions with the police. That's never been done before that I know of, where the police department actually acknowledges past wrongdoing. This is a huge step forward. I don't know exactly what the syllabus is at Ventura Sheriff's Academy, but I do know that the post-academy syllabus stresses this focus on relationships and on a service model.
And then my last question or comment is, I was a little maybe taken back of the distancing between slave patrol and law enforcement, because that has been one of the critical race theory content really talks about how, and it may just be a debate on semantics, but slave patrol was seen as a form of law enforcement, even though it wasn't a governmental entity. And at that time, they were sometimes self-selected or appointed by community leaders. So I think I agree that the idea of departments acknowledging past wrong, I mean, it's hard to do even just in a culture to acknowledge past wrong. But I do think it's important that we understand, or at least discuss, the connection between slave patrol and unofficial or unappointed, unofficially hired, paid for law enforcement.
I don't disagree with you. And in terms of, and I think I said that linkage is there. I do think it's important, and I'm not saying that it would have mattered. And so maybe we are debating semantics, but the slave patrols were never a formal part of local government. That's, and I think, and the police departments were, and so I'm trying to get a little bit of a separation there.
Yeah, maybe we can agree that it was part of an informal law enforcement because it was enforcing a law.
It was enforcing a social norm and a law, no question about that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Okay.
All right, if nothing for me. I'll return to the shadows whence I came.
Okay, thank you. Carol, is there a way to bring up my PowerPoint?
Yes, I'm gonna share my screen and I'll start your PowerPoint.
And did I unshare my screen? Did I do that
Yeah.
right? Good. Okay.
And while we get the PowerPoint going, I'll just go ahead and get started. I'm Graciela Reynoso, and I'm the Human Resources Manager. I'm here today to talk about some of the city programs that encourage and to a certain extent sometimes have to enforce a respectful and equitable work environment within the city. Next slide, please, Carol. So part of my presentation today will be just an introduction into policies and statements that serve as affirmation of our commitment to equal opportunity principles within the workplace, and talking about a little bit about the conversation that we're having with diversity and inclusion and equity. Next slide, please. So as part of the Human Resources Department, we often look to what are our city values when we really want to talk about what are our values and what are we going to strive for in goal setting. And I want to introduce to you, and I hope you've had a chance to read the organizational value statement, which was presented in 1986. You'll see words such as service to the community, value, worth, and dignity of individuals, diversity of experience and knowledge, equal opportunity for everybody within the city, gaining the public's trust. And another value is accountability among many of the statements that are made here. The reason I like to share this is because these are our organizational goals and will tie into the emphasis that we do have on a respectful work environment within the city. And when we hire individuals, this is what we look for. Will they add to our organizational goals and values? Next slide, please. This next document is called our Excellence in Customer Service Code of Conduct. And words that you'll find here that are being kind of outlined are goals such and code of conduct that is being espoused here is offering attentive and responsive service to the community and to one another. This is a statement that we'll be training further for boards and commissions later on this year. But what this code of conduct really encourages, and it has from 1997 on, it's an institutionalized document that we have encouraging an atmosphere of, attentive and understanding and responsive and fairness and respectful service to the community, to one another, and within the boards and commissions, to employees, etc. So I like to point this out because this is again another document that guides our principles as far as a workplace environment within the community and the city organization. And these are this kind of shows our systems at work and our values at work in enhancing our customer service. Next slide, please. So a lot of what we talk about when we talk about human resources and the type of environment that you really want to build within an organization, we have policies that I've kind of described to you already. So we have some organizational values and code of conduct documents that are really important within the city. Our non-discrimination and harassment policy and employee complaint procedure is another document where we really see the intersection of city policy and law. So it is illegal to discriminate and harass people based on the protected categories that you see listed here. And I know it's small print, but categories such as age and race and ethnicity, ancestry, physical or mental ability, gender identity. All of these things are protected under federal and state law. And the non-discrimination and harassment policy and anti-sexual harassment topics are topics that we find really important at the city, and we train every, according to law, every 2 years to our supervisors and managers, and all of our employees receive information regarding anti-harassment policies. So this is another important policy within the city that kind of builds the foundation for respectful work environment and for equity in our processes. Discrimination is defined as denying a good or of something of value to someone based on a protected category. And harassment is defined as, using like an epithet or a slur or showing aversion to any of these protected categories. So in educating about the policy and in educating employees what is protected activity, such as non-retaliation, we really build a foundation for a respectful organization. Next slide, please. And so that foundation that we have at the city, I believe really helps us when we look towards building the organization. And when we talk about issues of diversity and inclusion and equity, really a really important place to start with is access to the organization. So having an equitable hiring process where people are interviewed in a fair manner with a set of rules that I've listed here, such as, we qualify applicants, they're invited into a structured interview and everybody's asked the same question so that it is a fair playing field. We use this sort of oral board process for our police positions, for our fire positions, and for a number of our classified positions. We train our oral boards so that there is no, on how to identify potential pitfalls when you're interviewing. Some behaviors and biases maybe sometimes are not, you don't realize you have them. So we do list out some biases to try to avoid when you're interviewing people. And they could be anywhere from a bias towards, maybe a bias towards someone who reminds you of a younger version of yourself. So you know that they're going to be an up and starter and they're going to be a great person for the organization. But maybe the reason that you feel that is because they remind you of yourself. So in other words, always being conscientious to know where is a recommendation for a candidate coming from. We do espouse equal opportunity practices such as making a hiring decision based on job-related criteria. So I did want to point out that we do have this sort of oral board process for many of our departments, including the fire and the police department. Next slide, please. And so saying what I just said, which is that we strive really hard to have an equitable process for people, you'll see here that our diversity very closely is aligned with the community. I'll just give you a moment to look here, but for example, in the first column, you see the demographic and the ethnicity or race. The second column, you see City of Santa Barbara employees. And the third column, you're going to see Santa Barbara general demographics. So what does our community look like? You will find that they are very closely aligned. And we are proud to say that that is the case. So this structure that I've mentioned about having a respectful work environment, having a non-discrimination and harassment policy, educating our employees on the policy, and in addition, educating our interviewers who are going to rate and recommend employees, I think has helped to build a diverse city population that closely mirrors our community. Next slide, please.
Graciela, could I ask, based on that sheet, do you have a breakdown on city leadership and if it's representative of our community as well?
I don't have that with me, and I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I can get that to the commission. Thank you. Next, I thought that I would demonstrate the police department. So you heard from the chief, the police captains are going to be retitled to police commanders, but they're listed here as captains still. And you'll just see through the rank from captain to officer what our demographics look like. And the bottom row shows you the percentage of those demographics. We are very in tune with our data. So we are able to demonstrate here what the police department is comprised of in terms of a diversity aspect. Okay. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Commissioner Rodriguez, you spoke about efforts kind of from the community aspect in the formation committee and kind of what's going on out in the community. Within the organization, these are some of the efforts that we have taken to build a strong foundation for representation and diversity within our own organization. The conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion is growing. We've alluded to that today, that there is a conversation that is across all sectors, all communities, private industry, governmental agencies like our own, educational institutions, and throughout city and state agencies that are looking at issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion and how we can improve in this aspect. So some of the conversation has gone from what I showed you with the non-discrimination and harassment policy to being a conversation of allyship, taking an active role in being anti-racist, knowing that there is implicit bias out there that we have to recognize. We all have our biases, and make sure that decisions that we're making are based on facts and based on a structured process. So the conversation is only getting larger, and more people are joining that conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are a number of topics and resources out there that have to do with examining practices and where improvements can be had. So if you do a search, you will see that there is some documentaries like on Netflix, and there's books out there on anti-racism, how to have these conversations in a safe environment, and how to analyze our structures and further the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that is my presentation on what the city is doing to build a foundation for equity. And if there's no questions, I can turn it over to Lieutenant Hill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me?
Well, actually, sorry, I was just waiting to see if anybody else had questions. I do have a couple questions. One, just thank you. It's what you presented is very impressive. I am the demographics compared to the city employee demographics compared to our city demographics is, I mean, it is so on point, and I'm impressed. So thank you for doing this work. Thank you for having an emphasis on this at this time right now. It's so important. I'm curious how the trainings are being received within the different departments. I know that it's difficult material, it's uncomfortable material, and my hope is that folks feel more comfortable, but sometimes you have to be uncomfortable to get more comfortable. So how is it being received in the departments?
Thank you for that question. And I think you're absolutely accurate that people are coming to training and being very participative. A lot of training lately has, of course, been through Zoom or GoToMeeting because of the pandemic. And you would think that that would have a negative impact on participation. But this is a topic where people want their voice heard, because in one form or another, anybody of any demographic or any dimension has felt that they have been somewhat labeled or looked at a certain way because of how they present. So people are happy to share those experiences and happy to grow within those experiences. And it's always very valuable when you hear your coworker talk about what experiences they've had and how they will commit. Usually at the end of training, there's a commitment statement that says, as a result of today's training, I will focus on, and then fill in the blank for that individual. So my anecdotal information that I can share is that people have been very participative and grateful to have an opportunity to share their story and to have an opportunity to improve.
Wow, that's so great to hear. As commissioners and as this commission, is there anything that we can do to continue this or support the work that you're doing?
Like I mentioned, there will be commission and board training throughout the year. I believe last year we may have visited this commission with the non-discrimination and harassment policy, speaking about kind of some of the legal and policy kind of hot topics that we could talk about. That will continue as we move forward. You mentioned that there will be new commissioners coming on. I believe the application period closes around October 8th. So after that, after the new members are installed, we will be offering training on a myriad of topics. A lot of times it's just going to be, there's going to be the foundation of just mutual respect and understanding. So I appreciate your comments on the Community Formation Commission because I think that helps to cement the fact that the internal efforts that we're making are also being espoused externally through that commission as well.
Thank you for leading this. This is wonderful. Wonderful to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I'll turn it over to Lieutenant Hill. Thank you.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Commissioner Rodriguez, if you would allow me the liberty to respond as well, speaking specifically for the police department and how to support these training efforts, I would say that if you do have the opportunity to support the outcomes of the training, so if you see or hear of our employees who seem to be using this type of training to have successful outcomes, please let them hear about it. I think that reinforces the positive training, and it really lets them know that what they're doing is making a difference and people are noticing. That would be helpful. Thank you all for letting me speak tonight really briefly. My objective tonight is just to really quickly kind of tie together the two conversations that Chief Melekian discussed, race and policing, and then a little bit more of kind of policy and internal practices within our city police department. But I have to say I would be remiss if I didn't mention very briefly a little bit of history of the Santa Barbara Police Department related to your commission itself, because Chief Melekian talked quite extensively about the different eras of policing. And most people don't know that when the professional era of policing really started to take hold, especially in its infancy in the 30s and 40s, there was a police chief, an academic named August Vollmer, who was the Berkeley police chief and was considered by many the father of the professional era of policing. He actually came to the Santa Barbara Police Department at the request of the Police and Fire Commission. And you heard me right. It used to be called the Police and Fire Commission. I'm not sure when it changed, but the commission hired him at the rate of $100 a day to come and help reshape the Santa Barbara Police Department. And he did that. He took the train, which was called the Lark, from San Francisco, and came into Santa Barbara and really started that process for us of reform in that era. So a little piece of history that I think is fascinating.
What year was that?
That was 1934, specifically was in March. And he came.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. The city paid for him and his wife to come to Santa Barbara and put them up in a hotel to help really reshape the police department. What you might not know is in 1933 and 34, there was some corruption and graft issues, and there were some indictments, and they had to very quickly, almost overnight, reshape the police department. So it's a bit of history that's quite fascinating if you look into it. So I just want to really quickly talk about race and policing and draw a little bit from both conversations from the previous speakers. So really addressing issues regarding race and policing have pretty much been at the forefront of the conversation at most local agencies and generally the conversation nationwide surrounding 21st century policing. Departments hire people to police the community, and anytime people are involved, they come with their own experiences, and our own experiences shape the lenses with which we see the world. And sometimes those experiences shape our biases, and including racial biases, which is relevant to our conversation tonight. So we hire people, they have experiences, and those shape all of our biases. But just like any other organization, we put processes and policy into place to mitigate the harm that could come from people's individual biases. So there are, for example, laws that are put into place and codified to prevent people from acting on their biases. For example, and relevant to this conversation, there is a law against racial profiling. It's a California penal code, and it makes it illegal to racially profile. And we know that that is when a law enforcement officer targets a person solely based on the race or nationality. So there's laws similar to that. Even more recently, there's a law that was named the Racial and Identity Profiling Act. It's often referred to as RIPA. And that requires agencies to collect data on the people that police stop. So for example, when one of our officers makes a stop of a person, they will have to collect some of the demographic information and record that and turn it over to the state. It's mandated reporting. That law hasn't required our agency yet to report it to the state. It's coming. However, our agency decided to participate early, and we've already begun rolling out the RIPA data collection processes because it's a valuable piece of tool that will provide data for us and potentially point out things that we weren't aware of previously. So those are examples of some laws that are in place to address some of those race and policing issues. As Graciela discussed, some of those structures are put in place by department policies and training. Police are in a unique position in society because we all know we ask these employees, these people, to go into crisis and sometimes stop active violence and sometimes take people's freedom away by use of coercion. We're asking these employees to do that. So we have to have internal policies put in place to mitigate any issues that might come from biases. So we just to touch back on a question that was asked earlier regarding the Ventura County Sheriff's Department, they have an entire learning domain on principled policing, and that does touch on the history of policing, the errors of policing, and racial bias and implicit bias. So it is addressed not only, I'll speak to later when they get here, but our employees when they go to the basic academy, they get that training as well. And that's all instituted by our post-accreditation agency in the state of California. So we implement training at the police department and within the city to help employees navigate sensitive interactions with community members. Much of that training, as I mentioned, is required by California Post, Peace Officer Standards and Training. However, we also expand on those minimum requirements, and we look to our community to help us with training opportunities. For example, the last several times we conducted principled policing training at our department, we reached out and partnered with local trainers, community members, and local college professors who were specialists in the area. For example, a professor from Westmont who is a specialist in implicit bias, and we asked them and worked together with the community to write grants so that they could help us not only take the basic training that we're required to do, but really expand on that and tie in our local community. Additionally, when it comes to police-community relationships, we take a really evidence-driven approach to overcome the barriers that we all know can exist with police and the public. We expend quite a bit of energy and resources on interventions where police and people who have historically been disproportionately impacted by police are able to have a meaningful dialogue with police in a non-crisis environment. And that's important because we can't necessarily build meaningful relationships during a crisis. It's important to create space so that these relationships can build and we can really kind of unravel a lot of the historical trauma in a safe place where everybody feels comfortable talking. So we invest in that. And as a wise police executive once told me, culture eats policy for breakfast. So another point in this conversation is, and really relevant, is our police culture at our individual police department. And I think the programs and the experiences that we are working to provide our officers speak to our culture because it goes above the minimum requirements that's required by post or even by the penal code. So I think things where we're really reaching out to our community and making them a part of our training, or for example, a part of our promotional processes, which we do currently do. I think that speaks to our department culture. So those are just a few examples that I find relevant, kind of navigating the conversations that we heard tonight that speak directly to our police department. And I'm available to respond to any questions.
Can you just refresh us on the definition of implicit bias?
Sure.
In context, obviously.
Yeah, well, in its most simplistic form, it is just unconscious feelings that guide our behavior. These are things that don't come to our consciousness at the moment, but they may drive our decision. So for example, if a person has an implicit bias for example, against people with long hair. Let's just say someone who identifies as a man with long hair, then an implicit bias, that person may be affected by that. And what we really try to prevent is them taking police action on those biases, because we all have biases. Everyone does, unconscious and conscious. But what we really focus on is finding ways to reduce prejudice and specifically create policy and training so that no one acts on those biases. And specific to that point in the field of academia, there is quite a bit of evidence on how to reduce prejudice. And it comes from the field of social psychology or the field of communication. And it has to do with intergroup relationships, the us versus them, how we identify other people as in-group or out-group members. And the evidence is pretty strong that when we get those in-group and out-group people together under the right conditions, prejudice can and are reduced. And that really, quite frankly, drove one of the designs of the programs that I spoke of, which is named Voices, which really works to bring police and historically marginalized community members together so that they can really have meaningful dialogue, because the evidence suggests that reduces prejudice. And quite frankly, I think that's one of the objectives. We're trying to figure out ways to do that. And when I say we, I mean really the field of academia and police leadership.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Sean, would you mind, or Lieutenant Hill, would you mind sharing some maybe anecdotal or stories about how you've seen the impact of these trainings play out, or maybe dialogue or interaction in the Voices workshops?
Sure. And just to reiterate, the Voices workshop is where you heard Chief Malakian talk about what we call our post academy. That's where we bring the newly trained officers to our department for about 6 weeks and give them internal training. Our Voices workshop is a part of that experience, and that is where we kind of take policing to the local level, to community members here in Santa Barbara, in the city of Santa Barbara, so that they can share their experiences and, quite frankly, expectations of how they want to be policed. And during these workshops, I've seen many quite moving interactions. I'll share a quick couple. There was a workshop where our officers worked with previously incarcerated adults. That would be people that we would consider disproportionately impacted by police, especially when it has to do with specific races or demographics. So in those workshops, for example, I remember hearing a person who identified as a Black man sharing how he didn't necessarily hate police, but he felt he was mistreated and disrespected because when he was with his family, he was searched by police officers many, many times as a result of probation conditions. And he wasn't necessarily complaining that the search happened. It was in front of his children. And for him, and as most of us who are parents could probably understand, that's probably a pretty difficult experience to have. And when officers heard this story from this person, they started a discussion together about how they could accomplish what they needed to. And sometimes police need to search people, but how could they do it in a more respectful way that wouldn't humiliate this person in front of their family? And they started to have solutions to it. They said, well, we can certainly, see if the partner can take the kids and go somewhere else really quickly, and they can maybe not be in eyesight when this happens, or other things like that. But what it was the community member and the police officer figuring out solutions to overcome those really poignant interactions that can create a lot of anger and resentment and really create difficult relationships. I'll give you one other really quick example. Commissioner Rodriguez, there was one workshop where a female officer was in a discussion with another woman from the community, and the woman explained how she felt like officers really projected an attitude by the way they stood and by the way just the appearance of their face or their grimace is the way she actually described it. And, having their hands on their hips and, kind of like, felt that the woman was describing what she felt like it was an officer just had an authority problem. And the female officer described in this dialogue how actually it was quite painful to wear the belt and the vest. It was about 20 some pounds of extra weight that her body wasn't designed to wear. So she had to arch her back and put her hands on her hip to alleviate the pain she was experiencing in her back. And therefore she was slightly grimaced because she wasn't comfortable. And it's these little nuanced conversations that don't often happen during a crisis on the street corner that really allow people to start to create empathy. And really empathy is what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get other people from different groups who identify differently to understand each other. And the more that we can have the officers empathize with community members, and just as important, the community members empathize with the officers, the more progress we're going to make in relationships.
Thank you for those powerful shares. And just curious if future commissioners may be able to attend Voices trainings?
Absolutely. We're working through some COVID restrictions right now, but we are eagerly anticipating the return of those experiences for our community members and our officers.
Thank you. Good work.
Lieutenant Hill, how much, just to extend your comments on implicit bias, which were very succinct, how much of the psychological screening for early candidates that are selected for police training, how much does that psychological screening affect, the downstream behaviors that may become problematic or may become very positive? Do you see a correlation there?
Commissioner Stedman, I don't want to speak beyond my capability. I'm not privy to the entire psychological screening process. It's actually quite confidential, but I do know it's evidence-based. And I find it, in my experience, and I have managed the hiring department in the police department, I have found that it's a pretty powerful tool in screening. And I think that combined with the other elements that are our screening process together, they do make a pretty powerful and efficient process to screen out people who might not be the best candidates for us. It's not perfect, certainly not. We do find in the policing profession that sometimes we hire people that shouldn't be police officers. But by and large, my experience here with the Santa Barbara Police Department is that it's pretty effective. But again, that specific to the psychological part, it's pretty confidential, and I was never privy to the kind of interior of it, so to speak. I'm not sure if Chief Malakian has any further to say on that, but that's what I have for that response.
Well,
Does that help?
I think your comments are insightful, and maybe Chief Malakian will add. And before you do, Chief, my 10 years in the Navy, I was always fascinated by the aptitude testing. It's like certain people belong in submarine duty, certain people do not belong in submarines under the water for 6 months because they would just crack psychologically. But by and large, the Department of the Navy gets it right, so there is a strong correlation. And of course, guys that want to fly fighter aircraft are completely different than guys that want to be confined in a submarine, or men and women, I should say. So I've always been curious, about the psychological aspect when it comes to hiring, because in a previous role, the head of the Nevada Highway Patrol told me, he said that was his biggest issue in terms of keeping his pipeline, filled with suitable candidates. So I do appreciate your comments, Lieutenant Hill. Thank you.
And I'm not going to add too much to that. I will say that the psychological screening process has undergone really a continual reevaluation. And what's not probably appreciated is that and I don't know if that's what you meant about your friend from the Nevada Highway Patrol, but very often we will get candidates that on the surface seem like they would be very good additions to the police department who do not pass the psychological evaluation and they don't meet the post standards. And it's frustrating for police chiefs and it's frustrating for recruitment teams because these folks look really good on the surface. So this is, but this process, and it's been refined and refined and refined over the last 30 years with this idea of trying to find the people who are the most suitable. And of course, you're trying to blend a bunch of characteristics that very often would seem to be, sort of polar opposites. So you want somebody who's got a high level of empathy and a high level of emotional intelligence and ability to connect, who is also capable of going into a very violent situation on virtually no notice and responding appropriately. And so finding that balance is always a challenge.
Fair enough. Thank you. Any other questions from the commission for Lieutenant Hill or the chief or Graciela? All right.
If I could say one thing, Chair Stedman, before we close tonight. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation. I hope you found it informative. We put a little effort into it to try to convey. And secondly, I was giving some remarks yesterday, and I've said that sometimes I feel like a time capsule. And I feel like somebody reached into a time capsule and pulled me out of it and said, here, tell us what it was like back when. And I can tell you that back when and today are incredibly different in ways that almost defy description. Quite honestly, the Sean Hills of our profession are the future of it. And I think, I hope the commission and others, quite honestly, appreciate the evolution that American law enforcement has undergone over the last 30 years. It's not insignificant.
Well, and it's nice to get an update from 1934. We were probably due.
I wasn't here then. I hope you didn't derive that from Sean's comment. I didn't come down here on the train with August Bowman.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Well, thank you, Chief, Lieutenant Hill, and Graciela. This today felt like the most meaningful meeting we've had, in my experience on the commission. Not just for us as commissioners, but the public who's watching and the public who will be watching the recording. Thank you for doing this work towards equity and understanding biases and transitioning to a different, more progressive department and policing. Graciela, thank you so much for prioritizing this for our city. It's needed and it's timely and it's so relieving to know that we are ahead of the curve when it comes to this in our HR practices, in our policing, in our leadership. So just thank you for your work on this.
Graciela and the whole HR department really deserve a shout out. And I've worked with Graciela only for about 6 months, but the one thing I've figured out is that they don't do the work they do just to get numbers. They do the work they do because it's the right thing to do. And she needs that notice.
Excellent.
Thank you to all of you. It was a great presentation, and I just wanted to mention my 34 years with City Fire. We also grew along with the police department. That was a long time ago when I started, but yeah, the improvements and progress has just been great. Been great. Of course, I've been retired for 10 years now, but things are way better.
Excellent. Good to see the progress. Okay. All right. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Lieutenant Hill. Thank you, Graziella. All right, back to reality here, right? That was a great lesson. So we're at the end here, guys, of this meeting, which I thought would go a little bit longer. So I'm happy that it's only 12 minutes after 6. Are there any public comments, Carol? Anybody's hands raised out there?
No, Chief. I'm sorry, Chair Stedman. There aren't any comments.
I'll take it. Okay, perfect. Are there any further comments from the commissioners? All right. So we are now prepared to take a motion for adjournment. Anyone?
I move to adjourn.
Okay, I'll second that. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, we are officially adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for a great meeting.